Hello there, my name is Swifto, and this is the second part of my silly little audio story, Lab Rats, The Whole Story. This second part shall include Chapters 3. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 3. A whole series of bizarre events. Paul continued to stumble forward through the hellish heat while being blasted by the relentless sandstorm that scratched his face like 1,000 tiny knives. He was half deafened by the ghostly cries of the echoing wind, swirling the sands around him into an angry swarm of stinging grains. Off in the distance he could hear the loud rumblings of thunder that bellowed through his body as though he were nothing more than fragile vibrating glass. He could not open his eyes at all for fear of the sand blinding him, and whenever he was forced to open his mouth for breath, the sand would bombard his open face. Paul kept his head down and pushed with all his strength up and over the seemingly endless sand dunes in what seemed like an increasingly futile attempt to escape his perilous predicament. What had gone wrong, he thought to himself. How did he end up here in this awful place? Where was the time machine, and where was Colin? Puzzled by these questions, Paul quickly realised that he didn't even remember arriving to wherever he was. The last thing that he could remember was being in the empty void with Colin and the time machine. He had set the machine to take them back home to the lab, but after that, Paul could not remember a thing. His clothes offered little protection from the elements, being dressed in nothing more than a thin cotton t-shirt and trousers, which stuck unpleasantly to his sweat-drenched flesh. He gasped in the hot air, feeling like he was going to pass out from the heat and exhaustion. Not to mention the deafening cries of the banshee-like wind and the sand that never ceased to scratch his exposed skin. Paul felt weak and completely breathless. He was about to give up and collapse right there in the sand, when suddenly, as he opened his eyes slightly, he saw something that shocked him into amazement and regenerated his strength a little. In stark contrast to the hot sandy hell that Paul was currently experiencing, Colin felt the icy cold chill of the frost-glazed forest around him, which forced his little body to tremble uncontrollably. He was so stiff that he almost felt as rooted to the ground as the trees surrounding him. It was not a pleasant forest that Colin found himself in. There was hardly a sound to be heard. No birds, no buzzing insects, only the soft, icy breeze that seemed to stream through the dark, shadowy fingers of the dead tree branches. The wood was grey and brown in its bleak light, surrounded by dominating dark shadows creeping out of every frosty husk of a tree. All this was very strange to Colin, who had no memory of ever seeing such a place as this. He was unaware of how truly strange and creepy this unusual woods was, but he was instinctively aware of it being somehow wrong. He knew that the trees seemed exaggerated in their warped appearance, and that the atmosphere was creepier than he felt it deserved to be. It was almost as if it was designed to scare him, or at least make him feel very ill at ease. But Colin was indifferent to the supposed creepiness he felt he was meant to be feeling. As odd as this was, he was compelled by the cold to keep moving, and not think too much about the strange fantasy he now seemed to be a part of. He stumbled over snapping tree branches and twigs that littered the ground. Each snapping sound echoed uncomfortably in the dead silence of the fairy tale-like dark woods, forcing Colin to look around in sudden fear of being heard by some unknown entity lurking in the shadows. The more Colin travelled, the more he felt the uneasy feeling of being watched, perhaps even hunted. He tried his best to shake the feeling, but as he heard the echoes of the twigs breaking beneath his feet fade away into the distance, he got the distinct feeling that he could also hear the same echoing twigs snapping, travelling back through the air towards him from not so very far away. Colin stopped and swung round to hopefully catch his pursuer off guard. His heart was now racing as he frantically looked around for any signs of life. The stiff coldness he felt in his chest made it almost painful to breathe so rapidly. He tried to slow his heartbeat by holding his breath so he could better hear his surroundings, but it hardly made much difference. His heavy breathing blocked out any sound which he tried to listen for. As he waited for his heartbeat to settle, he felt the weakness from the cold stiffen his joints again. Colin hated the cold. Ever since he had woken up in the lab, he had longed for more heat, but now, as the frost nipped at his toes and fingers, he felt even more loathing for the cold than ever before. He was suddenly brought back into the moment by the sound of something snapping not too far away to his right. It sounded much louder and clearer than it would normally have done due to the absence of any other sound in the woods. Colin broke out in a cold sweat as his heart began to race again, looking intensely over in the direction of the sound's origin. "Paul, is that you?" Colin said in a low, nervous tone. "Hello?" There was no response, but Colin felt somewhat more comfortable after hearing his own voice, and no more snapping twigs. He turned back round and continued walking through the woods, the chill still nipping at his shivering body. Paul now found that the sandstorm had subsided slightly, and he was able to open his eyes slightly more. He was dumbfounded by the odd sight which he saw before him. It was a ship. In the middle of this strange desert, Paul had found himself looking at the black metal hull of a large boat. It wasn't just any boat, though. On its side in large white lettering were the words, "Caledonia McBrain." What the hell? Paul laughed in stunned astonishment. Walking down a large sand dune, he approached the vessel which lay on its side, half buried in the sand. It had a large sloping funnel that pierced into the other side of the sand valley which it rested in. The funnel was bright red, and although the top was hidden in the sand, Paul knew that it was tipped in black. On the side of the funnel was a large yellow circle with a red upright line in the middle. This was the McBrain logo, which appeared in all their sea vessels. He was able to make out the other smaller writing on the side of it. The Isle of Mull was the name of the vessel, and Paul vaguely recognised it in some distant memory of his. It was a passenger ferry that travelled to various islands in the Hebridean Islands of Scotland. But what on earth it was doing in the middle of this desert, which Paul guessed was not the earth at all, was the bizarre question that Paul was now trying to solve. As he made his way down the sand dune, he then walked around the colossal metal object which looked a bit like a beached whale stuck in the sand. As the vessel was lying on its side, Paul was able to climb up and enter a door into its slanted interior. He had to make a bit of a leap to the left side of the wall, which was now the ground. He was in the cafeteria section of the boat and was surprised to see everything so neat and tidy. He naturally expected the sideways orientation of the ship to have dislodged furniture and smaller items, but everything seemed oddly in order. Something didn't quite add up, and Paul knew straight away that there was something very strange going on in the boat's interior. It wasn't that everything was just neat and tidy. It was perfect. Looking around the spotless, untouched-looking cafeteria, he noticed that even the cutlery was neatly put away in its place, unbothered by the laws of gravity. He walked along the wall over the large, thick windows that rested on the sands below it. There were tables all around the room, fixed to the floor, and they were joined by a row of rounded, cheap yellow plastic chairs on each side of the long tables. Paul reached up to a table next to a window which he stood on, and picked up a menu. He picked up the menu with ease and noticed that it was not attached to the table in any way. Interesting, Paul thought to himself aloud. Paul then tried to place the menu back on the sideways table, but now the menu dropped and fell onto the window. Paul was now sure of what he had suspected. He believed that this was not reality. The question now was, if this was not reality, then where was he? And where was Colin and the time machine? Colin was now running through the woods, which had grown darker. Strange beastly howls could be heard, and the branches behind him snapped and thudded as though something large and ferocious was running after him. Colin stumbled over a large branch and nearly flipped over his own head due to the momentum of his running. He found himself clambering backwards into the roots of an old tree. There, as he sat breathlessly, staring out wildly into the darkness, he saw a ghostly green light approaching him. As it got closer, it appeared to be a set of glowing green eyes, which never blinked, or moved its gaze away from Colin, even as it darted through the trees. Colin could almost see a dark outline of a large creature as it got closer. He thought he could see the faint shine of snarling teeth, but it was too hard to make out any definite details. The thing was almost upon him. Other than its great thudding feet crushing the dead wood underneath it, it made no other sound as it approached the little boy, sickeningly methodically. The thing seemed to raise an appendage out from the dark shape of its body towards Colin. A sick, dead white-looking claw appeared in Colin's line of vision, and the monster seemed intent on catching the boy in its icy grasp. Then suddenly there came a bright, blinding flash of light. The beast recoiled back into the shadow, but just before it did, Colin got a glimpse of its arm. It appeared to be almost transparent, and had strange green spikes protruding from the sides, like the plates of a stegosaurus. The light faded, then grew again, pulsating weaker and stronger every few seconds, but it seemed duller than it had appeared beforehand as Colin got used to it. It reminded him of his earliest memory of waking up in the dull light of the lab. He got up and looked towards the sky to discover the origin of the light. It appeared to be emanating from a crystal that was wedged between two tree branches. He was about to climb up the tree to obtain the strange-looking crystal, but was startled when he saw something moving in the branches. He looked closer and saw that it was Paul. "Paul, there you are! Where have you been?" he called out. But Paul did not seem to hear him. "Paul!" he called out again, this time slightly annoyed. The light was shining in his eyes, so he took a step backwards to better shield his eyes with his hands. It was then that he felt someone standing behind him. He turned round quickly and saw a young boy who looked very familiar. It took Colin a while to recognise who it was, but eventually it dawned on him that he was looking at himself. The other Colin took no notice of him and was doing exactly what Colin had been doing beforehand, looking up at Paul in the tree, stepping backwards and shielding his eyes with his hands. A little freaked out by this strange sight, Colin was literally beside himself. He slowly backed away from the scene and noticed that the two strange apparitions of Paul and Colin seemed to fade away, along with the strange light in the tree. He soon found himself in the darkness once again, only now a cold wind was beginning to pick up. The whole forest seemed to subtly change into an entirely new kind of forest, as though Colin were in a dream. It now seemed much more overgrown. Bushes and large shrubs made it harder for Colin to push his way through, and much to his annoyance it began to rain. Softly at first, but then it really began to pummel Colin with icy hard drops of water that shot from the sky like tiny little watery bullets. Colin was not only frozen now, but he was also completely soaked and in a very ill temper. He tripped and stumbled his way through the dense growth of the jungle-like nightmare he was now forced to endure. As the rain continued its reign of terror, it turned everything into a slippery, squelchy mess. Colin was busy hacking his way through the jungle, barely able to see anything. The rain, darkness and thick vegetation made it impossible to get any idea of where he was heading. This almost led him to having quite a nasty fall. When he pushed through some tall, thick grass, he came out onto the ledge of a tall, slippery cliff. Almost slipping off the edge in sheer surprise, he watched as small pebbles he had accidentally dislodged from the ground made their painfully slow descent into the waves below. He knelt down and looked at the giant waves that battered the cliff face below. Mesmerised by this awesome sight of nature's raw power, he was oblivious at first to the other amazing sight that this water had to show him. A bolt of lightning struck the sea beyond and captured Colin's attention. Gasping with astonishment, Colin stood up and looked out to sea. Standing there proud, in grand defiance of the elements, stood a colossal black pyramid, protruding from the angry waves that crashed with all the strength of Poseidon against its sleek obsidian-like walls. Colin hardly had a moment to process this astonishing sight, before with another flash of lightning, the black pyramid and the sea disappeared into the empty darkness of the night. Paul thudded face first into the table and slid down into one of the uncomfortable yellow plastic chairs. Rubbing his face and trying to somehow relieve some of the pain, Paul looked around and saw that the cafeteria was now the right way up. He looked over at the window and saw the sand still blocking out any light from the outside world. "Yep, this is definitely not reality, I'm sure," he said as he felt the pain flowing to his numb nose. "Certainly feels like reality though. Ow." Paul got up and wandered over to the food serving area. He looked down at a metal dish containing some sort of green slime which he guessed must have once have been peas before someone overcooked them into a disgusting, mushy oblivion that they now dwelled in. He saw another tray which seemed to be serving steak pie. He dipped his finger in. It was slightly warm, as though whoever had cooked it had done so not too long ago. Sticking his gravy-soaked finger in his mouth, he gave it a thorough review. Not bad, I suppose. He then wandered casually over to the other side of the room and peered through the window. Nothing but sky, he observed. He sat down at one of the tables and began to fidget with the menu. He looked around the empty room, half expecting someone to appear and chase him out. But there was no one to be seen. This suited Paul just fine, as he wasn't too fond of other people and enjoyed the idea of having a large boat all to himself. He was busy messing around with some cutlery, making knives spin and trying to build archways with forks, when he was suddenly startled by the sight of someone standing at the doorway. Just as he looked up, the mysterious figure walked away down the hall. Paul got such a fright that he quickly jumped up and spilled knives and forks all over the table, himself and the floor. Hi, he stuttered out. Is that you, Colin? Colin? Paul had a feeling that it wasn't Colin, and he had the sinking feeling that he wasn't quite welcome on this boat. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, I'll be leaving now. Sorry. His voice became a hoarse whisper, as he struggled to overcome his nervous stammering. As he slowly made for the door that he had got in by on the other side of the cafeteria, he suddenly thought that perhaps he had been mistaken, as there was no sight or sound of the mysterious fellow passenger. He slowly crept along, watching the door into the hallway in the hopes of not angering anyone who might be out there. As he moved to the middle of the room, he had a much better view of the hallway, and got a sudden shock when he could see the dark outline of the person still standing there in the hall. It hadn't just been his imagination after all. He started to move quicker towards the exit, but then he stopped in a sudden bout of curiosity. Looking round nervously, he picked up the courage to try and talk to the shadowy figure. "Can I just ask, if I may, who are you? Is this your world? Where are we?" Paul waited for an answer, but none came. The person seemed to be moving now, but Paul couldn't make out clearly what they were doing. After a moment of confusion, Paul realised that the person was making some kind of hand gesture. It looked as though they were beckoning him to come closer. He took a deep breath and cautiously walked towards the hallway door. His eyes adjusted to the darkness as he approached and could now make out that the figure was of a young-looking woman who smiled at him as she waved her hand for him to come closer. Now, as he was just inches away from her, he could see that she was slightly odd-looking. She had a beautiful, clean-looking face, light skin tone and bright blue eyes. But her long, wavy hair was dark green, and her nose appeared to have just one big nostril rather than two, as Paul was used to seeing on human beings. Her clothes were of an odd fashion, tight and as bright a blue as her unusually shining blue eyes. "Come on, Paul, don't be scared," she said softly. Paul looked up and smiled at the woman as he stood right in front of her now. But his smile soon faded into a face of confusion as he noticed that the woman was looking right over him and still beckoning for someone to come closer to her. Realizing that the woman was not looking at him, Paul turned round to see what she was looking at. It was then at that moment Paul's surroundings suddenly seemed to change without him even realizing it. Looking behind him, his heart nearly reached up to his mouth with the sudden shock of seeing the vast void which was now around him. A sea of clouds carpeted the seemingly endless blue sky that Paul now found himself floating in. He heard the woman laugh softly, and the laugh seemed to fade away into the distance. He darted round terrified to look at her, but there was no one there. He was now all alone, floating above the clouds with the awful, fearful feeling that he was falling again. He felt a pain in his chest as the fear overtook him, then everything went black as Paul fell into an unconscious state. Colin found himself climbing up the steps of a spiral stairway. Cold, dark and grey was the best way he could describe his new surroundings. Everything around him was made from solid grey bricks, and every footstep echoed between the narrow walls. He had a hard time stepping up each stone step. It seemed as though the stairway was designed without any consideration for little people such as himself. He was slightly relieved to find a source of light in the form of a very small, narrow window, nothing more than a slit in the thick brick wall. He tried to see out of it, but the light was too bright, and could see nothing but whiteness. He thought he could hear the faint sounds of voices from up the steps, and decided to follow the sound, in the hopes of finding a way out. Perhaps he would find Paul and the time machine up there. At the top of the stairs he came to a large, heavy wooden door, with a dark metal handle adorned with some kind of fancy floral decoration on it. He pulled the door open with a heavy clunk which took nearly all his strength. Peering inside, he saw that it led to a long passageway of more dark grey brickwork. He could hear the voices more clearly now. They seemed to be singing, but he couldn't make out the words that they were chanting in a merry tone. There was but just one word he thought he could make out amongst the loud garble of noise, but he wasn't sure if he'd heard it right, as it was not a word he was familiar with. It was a word that sounded like gamut. He was about halfway through the passageway, treading softly on the thick red carpet that stretched from one end to the other, when suddenly the voices seemed to stop. He suddenly froze where he was instinctively, in fear that something was wrong. He heard a metallic clanking sound, and then the cry of someone in pain. It seemed like the whole place rumbled into chaos at that moment, as the voices started up again, this time shouting cries of rage and fear. The clanking of metal echoed in the passageway from other places nearby. Then the door on the other side of the passageway opened, and in stepped a tall man dressed in a dark metal suit of armour. His face was covered by a helmet that was vaguely reminiscent of something from ancient Greece. At his side, the man had in his right hand a long sword dipped with freshly spilled red blood. In his other hand he held a round shield, and on the shield was a sigil of a great black bird, its wings spread out and complete with sinister green dots for eyes. The man lifted his sword and slowly stepped towards Colin. Colin saw the evil intent in the man's eyes, shining through the narrow slit of his helmet. Colin went back to the door and swiftly slammed it shut, almost tripping down the steps as he ran for his life. The man in armour was already on his tail, surprisingly agile for someone dressed in solid metal plate. Colin got to the end of the stairs and raced to open the heavy door at the bottom of it. He pushed himself through the half-opened door and darted along another passageway, which seemed to fade into a soft greyness, which faded into a black void. He looked back to see if he was still being chased, but to his relief there was nothing but a whitish grey void behind him. He sighed and crouched down to catch his breath. Colin wondered what hellish circumstance he would find himself in next. Paul woke up to the sound of birdsong. He stretched and yawned and then opened his eyes. The sun was shining, and he felt a gentle breeze blowing through his hair. He felt the grass touch his hands and his face, and sat up to find that he had been sleeping in a garden of bright green grass. All around him were trees rustling softly in the breeze, and small birds flying in and out of their bushy green branches. It was a pleasant scene, and Paul for a brief moment forgot all about his strange adventure, the time machine, and even Colin. He felt glad to be outside again in a natural environment after so long stuck inside his lab. Then, as he had this thought, it all came back to him. His lab, the time machine, Colin, and the strange events that led to him being here. Remembering that this was not real and that this was some kind of strange illusion, he strengthened his will and stood up straight, determined to get his time machine back and to get back to reality. He looked around, and then he looked behind him. He saw a large pale brown brick building, very modern looking and dotted with lots of windows. A slight knowing smile shaped itself in Paul's face. Is that supposed to make me feel scared? He asked, thinking possibly that someone was deliberately toying with him. It's no use trying to upset me by bringing me back here. I know this is an illusion. So you better cut out all this nonsense and give me back my time machine. Do you hear me, whoever you are? Just because you brought me back here, it doesn't mean I'm going to give you the satisfaction of letting you see me get upset. As if some unknown entity understood what he was saying, the building, the trees, and the grassy garden all faded away, and Paul was left in darkness. At last we're finally getting somewhere, Paul said to himself smugly. Colin stood up again after catching his breath, and saw that he was now in a very strange-looking place which he did not recognise at all. Paul, on the other hand, would have instantly recognised the place Colin now found himself in, as it was his home. Colin was standing on the slippery pavement of a busy demon-filled street at night after a rainstorm. The puddles and damp patches glittered brightly in the darkness of the night, reflecting the lights of the lamppost and neon shop signs. But this was not quite the demon field that Paul was familiar with. Cars rattled along the road, honking as they went by, passing horse and cart, which rattled and clipped-clopped along the stone road. All the men who walked by wore suits and hats, and the women were dressed in very fancy-looking garments, which looked not at all similar to the plain and drab women's fashion of Paul's time. This was in fact Demonfield of the 1930s. People came out of a door across the street, and Colin could hear the sound of swinging jazz music, mixed with the chatter of a crowd of people enjoying themselves. He started walking along the street, carefully dodging past the other pedestrians as they gave him funny looks. As far as he could remember, he had never seen anything like this place before, and was shocked to see so many people. He wondered if this place was anything like his home. Was this where he belonged? Here, in this strange place with other humans? "Colin," whispered a voice behind him. Colin looked round and saw Paul hiding in the shadows behind a dustbin. "Paul? Is that really you? I mean, the real you?" Paul crept out, carefully observing his surroundings before approaching Colin. "Yeah, of course it's the real me. Listen, I think I know what's going on here. What is this place? Why does everything keep changing? Don't ask me how, but I think somehow we've entered into a strange psychic realm that has the ability to read our minds and project our thoughts into existence." Eh? What the hell does that mean? It's taking our thoughts, our memories, and making them become reality. Tell me, where did you start off from? I mean, after I set the time machine to go back to the lab, where did you end up after that? I don't know. There were these things that came out of the ground, with sort of long, fingery hands coming out of the top of them. They were everywhere, and parts of the fingers lay all over the ground and snapped when I walked on them. Paul thought for a moment, puzzled by this strange description. Trees. You saw trees, right? If you say so. So, you were in a forest. That's interesting. When I regained consciousness, I was in a desert, in a sandstorm. Only thing is, I've never been in a desert before in my life. I wonder if you have. A desert? I don't think so. You must have. You just don't remember. After walking in the desert for a bit, I came across a boat called the Isle of Mull. That was taken from my memory. But after that, I saw a woman with green hair. Does that ring a bell to you? Perhaps it's your mum, or your sister, or someone you know? No, I can't remember anyone with green hair. Come on, Colin, you have to think hard. Try and remember. We've been given a great opportunity here to try and retrieve your memory. If you can focus on something familiar that you or I may have seen, then it could be a key to unlocking your memory. If you can get your memory back, then we can get you back home, and we can get out of this mess. I'm trying to remember, but nothing I've seen so far seems familiar to me. Okay, tell me what else you saw. Perhaps there's something we can use. Well, I saw trees, a big building coming out of the water. I was chased by a man in strange clothes, but nothing... Wait, I did see something very strange. What? I saw us. I mean, an image of us. It was after I was chased through the trees. I stumbled and I was about to be attacked by a white monster that had glowing green eyes and spikes running down to its arms. Paul backed away slowly into the shadows, slightly in shock. You saw that? Yeah, why? Have you? Paul did not answer. Then what happened? Paul asked. Well, like I say, I was about to be attacked by this monster when suddenly there was this bright light. It was like a glowing rock, high up in the tree, and you were there climbing up the tree to try and get the rock. I tried to talk to you, but you didn't answer. Then I saw myself looking up at you. It was so strange that I just legged it out of there. That's very strange. Obviously not a memory, but this strange place we're in also showed something from my memory, the boat, and what I must assume was in one of your memories, the desert and the sandstorm. So it seems that random things are being rearranged to create all sorts of strange imagery, much like how dreams must work when we were asleep. Perhaps what you saw was one of your memories, but recreated using elements from elsewhere. Maybe the person you saw in the tree wasn't really me, but someone from your past. Think, does that image of me in the tree remind you of anyone else you once knew? Just then, the boys heard screams, and they saw people running down the street. A crashing sound like thunder was heard as a shadow appeared, towering over the building of the street beyond. The Godzilla-like shadow smashed into the buildings, giving a blood-curdling roar as it did so. As the colossal beast came into view, the boys could see that it was monstrously ugly, with big black eyes and spider-like fangs dangling from its face. It was so horrible looking that Paul momentarily mistook it for the face of Margaret Thatcher, before realising that the colossal spider-faced beast was not that scary. With a lizard-like claw, the huge beast picked up a car and smashed it into one of the buildings. Bits of debris rained down on the defenceless people fleeing for their lives. Paul and Colin instinctively ducked into an alleyway for cover. They watched as people ran screaming. The ground shook with shattering tremors of the beast's slow footsteps. "Oh my god, we're gonna die!" screamed Colin. "No, wait, this isn't real," Paul tried to say, unconvinced by his own words. "This is all an illusion, remember? It's taking bits of random memories and combining them into this strange fantasy. This is like something from an old film I saw, like King Kong or something like that. It's just changed things around a bit. But it is just an illusion, and therefore cannot hurt us." "Oh, are you sure about that?" "Trust me, just try and focus. Focus on something you know is real. Focus on me, and I'll focus on you. Don't be distracted by the monster or the people screaming. That's easier said than done. Come on, just focus." Paul closed his eyes and held on to Colin's shoulders. The sound of the beast's footsteps got louder, and it seemed as though the walls around them started to move. The sound was so loud that Colin couldn't help but cover his ears. He closed his eyes and tried to ignore it, focusing on Paul. but it was difficult to block out the earth-shattering vibrations around them. I can't! Focus, damn it! Colin thought he could hear the sound of the beast crashing down its large claw on the roof above them. He felt as though he was close to death. "Come on," shouted Paul. "Focus only on my voice. It can't hurt you, it's just an illusion." Suddenly everything seemed to stop and was replaced by dead silence. "Am I dead? Did we die?" Colin asked, too afraid to open his eyes. "No, it's over. You can open your eyes now. You might recognise where we are now." Colin slowly opened his eyes and looked around in disappointment. Oh no, not again. Around them was nothing, but a bright, white shining nothingness. They were in the same empty void that they thought they had escaped from. "I don't think we ever left, to be honest," said Paul. "I think this whole time we've been stuck in this empty void, filling it with our own thoughts and nightmares. But the time machine, we got back to it, and you set it to go back home. What happened?" "An illusion, it would seem." "So is that it then? Are we doomed to spend the rest of our lives stuck in this empty void?" "Well, for the time it seems like that might be a very probable conclusion, yes." Colin sighed and rubbed his eyes. He was on the verge of crying. "It might not be so bad now that we know what can happen." "What? You're joking, right?" "Well, so long as we can get control of our thoughts, we might even be able to have a little fun in this strange world of ours." Paul closed his eyes and concentrated hard on a mental thought. To Colin's surprise, a sandwich appeared from thin air. "Hey, it works! I made myself a ham and quaver sandwich," Paul happily exclaimed. He took a big crunching bite out of the sandwich and seemed to enjoy it for a moment, before changing his mind. Not exactly as satisfying as the real thing." "Let me have a go at imagining something," Colin said, perking up a bit. "Alright, go for it." Colin closed his eyes and focused hard, but he couldn't think of anything to create. What should I try and make?" "Can't you think of anything? Not even some kind of food you like?" "Food? I don't remember what I like." "I'm guessing that's why we were in an empty void for so long. This place must have been reading your thoughts." "Oh, haha, very funny. Jokes aside, we should try and use this place to our advantage. If it has the power to project our thoughts and memories into illusions, then we might be able to project a forgotten memory of yours, which could unlock your amnesia, or whatever it is you're suffering from. What's the point if we can't even get back home anyway? Come on, just try it. If you can remember where you're from, or at least who you are, then if we find the real time machine again, we might be able to get you back home. If not, then at least we'll die here with the satisfaction of knowing who you are. That's something, is it not? Alright, let me try and think." Colin closed his eyes and tried to focus, searching his hazy dark memory for even the faintest whiff of a recollection. Slowly, a blurry image came into focus. Paul looked on as the image became clearer. "No, this isn't right. This must have been taken from my memory." "What is it?" Colin asked, opening his eyes. He saw builders working on a large suspension bridge, which stretched over a deep, dark body of blue water. In the distance there was a city framed between the thick red wires that ran up the bright red painted metalwork of the bridge. This is the Silent Bridge that was to connect the city of New Glasgow to the island city of Silence. Huh? There are cities in the south of Altiov. That's the country which I live in. It's a small continent in the Atlantic Ocean. Colin looked baffled by this combination of strange words. "Oh, never mind. All I'm saying is that this seems to be more likely to be one of my memories that you've somehow transmitted. Or to be more accurate, it's one of my dad's." "Eh? How can you have one of your dad's memories?" "A little side effect of the Smarto Ray. I gained a lot of technical information in the form of memory implants, but some of his own personal memories leaked into the coding too by mistake. He was there when they were building the bridge in the early 80s. Paul suddenly drifted into an almost trance-like state as he remembered to himself. That was just a few weeks before it collapsed. He looked over at Colin almost with tears in his eyes. The bridge was never completed. A few days before they were scheduled to finish, there was an earthquake. Most of it fell into the sea. Many lives were lost that day. Just one of the many dangers of living in Altiov and being so close to the Mariana Trench. Suddenly another image appeared that was totally alien to both of them. They saw an image of a large shining object in space. As they looked closer, it appeared to be a spiral object made of some kind of metal. "What is that?" Paul asked. "I don't know, it just appeared. I wasn't even trying to focus on anything." "Well, I've certainly never seen anything like that before. And it looks to me like a space station. A spiral space station. We definitely don't have anything like that in the 20th century. It must be one of your memories." "A spiral space station? I don't even know what that is." "That's just because you haven't properly remembered it yet. But it's there in your subconscious. See, I told you you were from the future. This space station, is it your home perhaps?" "I really can't remember." "Come on, just focus. You must remember it. What year is this memory from?" "I don't know. I don't even think this is one of my memories. It doesn't feel right." The image of the spiral space station began to fade. "No, come on," Paul tried to encourage Colin. "Don't lose focus now. Try and remember." But it was too late. The image had disappeared. "I'm sorry, I just couldn't remember that at all. I don't know where it came from." Well, never mind. Perhaps we can try again later. Maybe if we let your mind rest for a bit, it might help. Here, let me show you something cool in the meantime. It might inspire you to recall something of your own." Paul focused hard on creating a new image. "You remember that street we were just on a moment ago? The one with the giant monster? That was Demonfield. I'd guess sometime in the 1920s or 30s. That's where I live, where my lab is. Only I'm from the year 1999. Suddenly a huge image appeared beneath their feet that looked like a giant 3D map of a city. The city sprawled into existence, stretching out into the void. Colin looked down at the city Paul had created in amazement. "Whoa." Paul pointed out towards the sea at the small island that was attached to the mainland by two bridges on its north and south end. In the middle of the island was a large, ominous grey-black tower. "Do you see that big tower over there in the distance? That's Altiov Tower, or as it's sometimes known, the Giant's Tower. It's a huge tower made of solid rock, said to have been built by an ancient civilization that lived thousands of years ago. Experts are still baffled by its construction. It's supposed to have been carved out of one single giant rock, or so the old story goes. Obviously that can't be true, but they haven't discovered how it was built yet. The old Altovian legend says that there used to be a volcano that blocked Demon's Bay, but a kindly giant blocked up the volcano and then carved the mountain into the tower so that the people who lived in the valley below could use the tower to watch out for invaders from the sea. But without the mountain there, the sea came in and flooded the valley and created Demon's Bay." "Whoa, that's kinda cool." "Yeah, I've always been fascinated by the Giant's Tower. Part of the reason why I built the time machine. I wanted to go back and discover how it was actually made." "What about this green area over here?" Colin asked, pointing to a dense wooded area north of the city. "Oh, that's Farway's Forest, sometimes referred to as the Forbidden Forest by some local folklore. It was named after the man who discovered the land of Altiov and the ancient ruins which Demonfield was built on, Captain Farway. He disappeared into that forest shortly after discovering it, and was never seen again. There are many stories of evil things living in the forest, and to this day it's still a place most would avoid going into. You've been in there, haven't you?" Paul looked at Colin, slightly surprised by the question. "It's true, isn't it? That's where I was earlier, in your memory of it. What did you see, Paul? Why did it scare you so much?" Desperate to change the subject,
Paul's image of the city disappeared, and he closed his eyes again to focus on something new. But Colin closed his eyes too, and thought very hard for a moment. "Hey Paul, check this out." An image of Paul appeared and started walking about like a puppet, with its mouth opening and closing when it spoke, like a badly animated sock puppet. "Hi, my name's Paul. I'm so stupid and smelly. I live in a crappy looking lab with a time machine that looks like a pile of junk and can't even time travel." "Hey, stop that." Colin laughed hysterically. "Oh yeah? Well, watch this then." Suddenly, another crappy-looking puppet creature appeared that looked just like Colin. "Hello, I'm Colin. I'm so dumb I can't even remember my own name. I also like playing with girls' toys." "Why, you dirty little rat." The two puppet versions of Paul and Colin began to fight each other. The Paul puppet whacked the Colin puppet over the head repeatedly with a mallet, while the Colin puppet bashed the Paul puppet in the face with a cricket bat. Then, out of nowhere, the Paul puppet pulled out a cheesy-looking ray gun, but the Colin puppet outdid that by pulling out two cheesy-looking ray guns. Then, the Paul puppet materialized a nuclear missile and fired it into the sky. The two puppets burst into flames and melted. Then the images began to fade into nothingness. Paul and Colin laughed together at the silly puppet show they had created. But their laughter soon died down when they realized that they were no longer alone. "Are you boys enjoying yourselves?" asked a mysterious figure who stood a few feet away from them. The stranger was a tall, skinny-looking man. He wore almost entirely all white, apart from a pair of shiny grey boots and a grey cape which attached to his bright white suit at the neck, which spiked out at either side, making it look as though his shoulders had horns. But his clothes were not the strangest thing about the man. He also had an enlarged cranium that made his head look unusually bulbous. His tall, skinny body looked as though it would not support such a large head. His facial features were sharp on his long, serious face. He had an odd, kind, but slightly sinister-looking face that was very hard to read. His beady blue eyes seemed all-knowing, but gave little away of his true feelings or intent. The boys could not tell if the slight smirk on his face was malevolent or benign, but they had a feeling that he was a being of great power and presence that could wipe them away in an instant if it took his fancy. "My apologies for keeping you here, but it was necessary to protect you from danger." "Where exactly are we?" Paul asked. "As you have correctly observed already, you have travelled not in time, but into another realm of existence. This here is my own little domain, a pocket universe that exists outside the time-space continuum which you have travelled from." "Who are you?" Colin asked. The man in white did not answer at first, simply smiling slightly. "We shall meet again, young friend. Then all shall be revealed to you. But only when we meet again, in the future. Or perhaps it is the past." "Why can't you tell us now?" Paul pushed for an answer. "Time travel is a very dangerous business and should not be attempted by ones as young and as inexperienced as you. You're lucky you stumbled into my realm and I was able to keep you from harm. However, I have no intentions of keeping you here indefinitely. You are free to return home." The man with the enlarged cranium gestured outwards with his right arm, and Paul and Colin saw that the time machine was behind him. They wondered how they did not see it before that moment. They walked apprehensively over to what they hoped was the real time machine. They both wondered if the odd-looking man was real or just a creation of their inventive subconsciousness. "You said time travel was a dangerous business," Paul asked. "I take it then that you have some experience with time travel yourself." "Now that you have your time machine back, I trust that you will be able to find your own way home. I must leave you to now, as I have other business to attend to." "Wait, what about this place? I mean, how does it work? What is the purpose of this pocket universe of yours?" Paul had 101 questions he would like to have asked the stranger, but he simply vanished into thin air, with no answers other than a slight smile on his long, thin face. The two boys were alone again in the empty void with just the time machine, as solid and seemingly as real as when they had left it. "Who was that guy?" Colin whispered as he hung onto the side of the time machine, afraid that he might float up off it again. "I don't know." "You don't think that was... you know..." "You know what?" "You know, the big cheese." "God, you mean?" "No, I don't think so. Seemed more like a devil, if you ask me." "But he helped us get the time machine back." "Did he? If he kept us here to protect us from some kind of danger time travelling, why didn't he show up at first? Why did he let us go through that nightmare realm of our own imagination? And what danger were we in exactly? Notice how he didn't want to answer any of our questions? He wouldn't even tell us his name." You're right. It almost seems as though this was all planned somehow. "Yes. He did say that we would meet again. I suspect he has a reason for letting us go. Question is, what? Well, if he is some kind of devil, then that explains the hellhole of a void we've just been trapped in. Yeah, as fascinating as this place, I'd very much like to get back to the safety and comfort of my dark and dirty laboratory now." Paul tapped away at the keyboard, and the protective shield bubble engulfed the time machine. Thankfully, I have a specially coded return home button installed, so we should arrive back at the lab just a few moments after we left. A wormhole opened up below the time machine, and before Colin could process the feeling of being pulled through the warping space around him, he found himself arriving at lightning speed back to familiar surroundings.
That is the end of part 2 of Lab Rats, the whole story. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you come back for part 3. Adios.